Hey y'all. So it's actually not that early in the morning. I'm on my spring break. So I'll be doing a lot more videos this coming week since I'll be home during daylight hours. Today I want to talk about Barnaby Rudge. I'm going to do two videos on Barnaby Rudge. This first one is going to be on why the novel was a flop, and the second one will be about the title character Barnaby Rudge. So why the book was a flop, actually one of the reasons is that title character Barnaby Rudge, and I'll talk about it when I get to that video. But I see two main reasons it was a flop, and it has to do with it being a historical novel. So let's do a compare and contrast between Barnaby Rudge, which is about the Gordon Riots of 1780, and it actually takes place in 2 years, 1775, that's when it starts, and then, you jump cut to 1780. Okay, so 1775 and 1780. Let's contrast that to A Tale of Two Cities, which occurs about a decade later. It also has a time cut, and I don't remember the specific years. I'll get to that when I get to that novel, but it does end with the Great Terror of the 1790s, probably 1792. I could be wrong about that specific year. So, number one, Barnaby Rudge, 1775 and 1780. What's going on with the UK in 1775 and 1780? It also has a plot hook. Maybe war with the colonies? And that was a war the Brits lost. In 1775, we have two main characters, Joe Willett and Edward Chester, run off and join the British Army. And yeah, they do go fight in America. And they come back in 1780. Now, the war wasn't over in 1780. That wasn't until 1781. But by 1780, it had to be pretty clear that the Brits were not going to win this war because the French had come in on the American side with a lot of money and materiel. And then also they did bring in Navy and troops and stuff. And there was just no way the Brits were going to win at that point. So this is a reminder of a war they lost because of France. This is not a popular item, and actually when it comes to the Tale of Two Cities, one of the main characters gets in trouble for making a mild joke about George Washington. It's still a sore point. Of course, that's post-war, post-American Revolution, after the Brits had lost, so obviously the English are a little touchy about it. Now, they weren't so touchy in 1841 when this novel was being serialized about that, but they can't have been too happy about it. So that's one aspect, but the biggest aspect is what happened in 1780, and that actually is related to the American Revolution, the Gordon Riots. I didn't know about the Gordon Riots before I read this novel. The Gordon Riots were a bunch of riots, and it was mainly in London, for about a week in June in 1780. What spurred the riots? There were several things, and part of this was, at the time, and this has nothing to do, well, actually, no, I'm sorry, it does have to do with the American Revolution. A lot of this does. You got to remember, the Brits were also fighting the French in other venues at the time, not just in the colonies. So the issue was they were going to reduce the strictures on Catholics in the United Kingdom. And they were going to pass the law, and I think it was called the Penal Acts, were the ones that were against the Catholics. And this, I think these were set up primarily after the Guy Fawkes thing during the time of James I. So it had been around for a long time. It goes back a couple hundred years, where Catholics could not inherit property. They couldn't educate their children in Catholic schools in the UK. They had to send them to France to get educated. That happened to a couple characters in the novel, etc. The problem is, of course, there still were Catholics in England, but also Ireland and Scotland. And they needed the people for the British Army. What had been happening, though, is they were, bringing guys into the army did not make them swear the oath to the Church of England and that kind of thing. So the thing is, there were the laws on the books, but they weren't really enforced, and there were various workarounds about the inheritance thing and this, that, and the other. But it was getting to be a bit unwieldy, and so Parliament was looking to relieve that pressure a little bit. So they were going to revoke the Penal Acts, or they were going to change it so it was less harsh on Catholics. So in response, there was the Protestant, what was it called? The Protestant Association, and this is Lord George Gordon, who is a bit of a nut, and Dickens does prefigure that in this novel. And he got people to sign a petition, and they were saying the Catholics were a kind of fifth column because, obviously they would ally with the French with regards to America, and they'd be fragging their officers, stabbing them in the back, and yada, yada. And this is why we're losing the war. No, you're losing the war because you have the people who are fighting in their own land, and then you have the resources from a much richer country of France who really want to destroy England. Okay, it had nothing to do with Catholicism. But in any case, various parties took advantage of the situation, and Lord George Gordon marched to London. He had a petition to submit to Parliament, and he had tens of thousands of mainly men, and tended to be lower class men in the city. And Parliament rejected his petition. And of course, the rabble rioted. It was mob violence. They set fire to stuff. They set fire to Newgate Prison, which was a fairly new prison at the time. People died. A lot of people died in the fire. And Dickens is very, very graphic in the mob violence scenes. The one that always sticks out to me, so it wasn't just in London, they actually went out to some of the suburbs where there were estates of Catholic gentlemen, so rich guys, and burned down their houses and that kind of thing. So they make it a plot point because it's one of the main characters, and he's deliberately targeted, and it has nothing to do with his Catholicism, just personal enmity between various people. That said, what is being displayed, they set his house on fire, but of course he has a bunch of liquor in the basement. And so the rioters go, and a lot of them get stinking drunk and die in the fire as a result. The one that sticks out in my mind, there is a young man who is dead drunk, about to be dead, because the lead off the roof has melted and fallen on his head, and his skull has melted like a candle. And that's Dickens' terms. That's pretty grody. And then in London, again, they break into a vintners, brewers, and that kind of thing, and you have liquor running in the ditches in the street, and there's fire, and the alcohol is on fire. And Dickens talks about the people who are trying to drink the fiery liquid, and they suffocate from the fumes and die, or they have burnt their esophagus and they die. That's pretty horrid. So yeah, that's kind of grody. But he has stuff like that in Tale of Two Cities. A lot of violence, a lot of horrific violence in that one too. So why was that a big hit? And that way he wrote that decades later, versus Barnaby Rudge. Well, I think it's pretty easy. It's because that's violence over there. It's in Paris, not in London. The Gordon Riots were something that had actually happened in London, and it could happen again, and people didn't want to think about this. This is in 1841, so this is before the big revolts across Europe in 1848. It's also before the Great Famine in Ireland in the late 1840s, like about 1845 to 1849. That said, there were a lot of problems, a lot of social problems with poverty and hunger that were well known, and Londoners were always scared of another riot breaking out and fire breaking out in the city. After the Gordon Riots, they instituted the Metropolitan Police, I believe. They didn't have anything like that. The army actually had to come in and impose order in London. And so the reason why I think Barnaby Rudge was unpopular as a historical novel is it highlighted problems of England. And it wasn't really about religion, though. And here's another thing, they're really not going to like that. None of the members of the Protestant Association come off looking well. A lot of them are shown as being opportunistic, greedy, rapacious, literally, definitely murderous. Most of them are shown as having no good motives. And that a lot of it is being driven by envy and driven by personal hatreds. that's not going to go over well. So Dickens was reminding the British about something they don't want to be reminded about. And the American market couldn't buoy it, even if they were interested in such a thing, and I don't think the Americans would have cared either. I think it wouldn't have been uncomfortable to Americans, but I think the Americans just wouldn't care about this like they liked Old Curiosity Shop. But that's for the next video with regards to the characters. And as regards to America, when I get to Martin Chuzzlewit next month, I'll have a lot more to say about Dickens in America. Bye.